Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome back to module number 3 with myself, William Eames. Did you know that HDR, High Dynamic Range Photography, is not a digital invention? It has literally been used for centuries. The Great Wave is a combination of two negatives to achieve tonal balance, and this is by Gustave Le Gray, and it's circa 1857. Only about 20 years after the official invention of photography. Gustave Le Gray was a technical prodigy as well as an artistic genius as well, and like a lot of photographers that we have looked at throughout this course, has a really fascinating story. You should definitely check him out. But as you can see in this two photograph, we have a combination of two negatives. We have the sky and we have the waves. Gustave Le Gray understood the limitations of his camera, of his negatives, their ability to capture the light in both the brightest and darkest parts of the pictures, hence the combination of two exposures together. You're here with myself, William Eames, your course educator. I hope I find you all in great form, and I'm so glad that you keep attending these lessons. It really is the key to success, is to show up to as many lessons as possible. So, as you may have guessed from our opening fact, this lesson is all about HDR, about high dynamic range photography. Now, really what we're going to have a look at in this lesson is the best practices for HDR, for capturing HDR photographs. We won't be looking at combining those exposures together. That's something that we're going to do in our next module when we start having a look at how to do all our post-production. But really this is just going to have a look at how we can prepare for HDR correctly and why we should use it as well. So HDR, has this association with making everything look kind of hyper real and almost exaggerated in some cases, but it really does have a technical use, and that's really the context that we're going to have a look at it in this lesson. We're going to have a look at dynamic range first of all, and I know at this stage I've spoken about this quite extensively. But really, it's so important to understand when it comes to exposure. And we've looked at it quite a lot now. We've looked at how we can overcome it using our filters and that are available to us. But there is going to be times where we may not have filters available to us, or simply they're just not right for the situation. And this is when we might introduce high dynamic range. But there's a couple of really interesting facts about dynamic range. So first of all, we should be well aware at this stage that dynamic range is the difference between the darkest and the lightest tones in a photograph, generally pure black and pure white. Okay, so we can see here there's a big difference. We've seen this photograph before. Our camera sensors are limited by dynamic range. Now, this varies from camera to camera, but basically, this can affect exposure when there are extreme contrasts in tones. Our cameras cannot see the same way that our eyes see. Our eyes can see much more detail compared to our camera sensors, no matter how good an exposure we get. And when we talk about the human eye, if we were to measure it, dynamic range is measured in stops of light when it comes to photography. Now, dynamic range is also something that's present in sound as well, for any of you who have any interest in sound or are sound engineers. But when we speak about dynamic range when it comes to photography, we talk about it in terms of light, and as we know, light is measured in stops. So we also know that stops are either doubling or halving the amount of light. Our eyes will see about 18 stops of light. So 18 stops, that's a huge range. This means we can see a huge range of light and dark details at any one time. So that's a huge amount of detail. Now, times when we will see the limitations with the dynamic range of our own eyes is when you think about extremes. So for example, if you're in a pitch black room to the point where your eyes cannot adjust and cannot see anything, this is when the light is so dark that it's gone beyond the dynamic range that our eyes are able to see. Or if you think about when you're in a dark room and you open a window or you open a door to let light in, your eyes are flooded with light and you get that really bright light that really hurts your eyes. That really bright flash of white light before your eyes adjust. That's again, the dynamic range of the brightest light being outside of what we can see. Now, comparatively then, our digital camera sensors now, as I said, this will vary slightly from camera to camera, but the dynamic range of a camera sensor in comparison is 12 stops. So 12 stops of light. The camera cannot see as much detail in the bright and dark parts of the scene at any one time. So think about this compared to the 18 stops of light that our eyes can see. So we have 3 stops on either side that our cameras cannot see. There's parts of the dark detail and there's parts of the bright detail that our eyes can see on a day-to-day basis that our cameras simply cannot see in a single exposure. So let's see how that might look then if we were to compare what our eyes see compared to what the camera sees. So we have a scene here. And this is what we see with our own naked eyes. We can clearly see all the bright details and all the dark areas in the scene. Even with a bright light source, even with the sun going down here, we can still see all of the details. Now, this is just a representation, an approximation of what our eyes would see. But we would expect to be able to differentiate between the bright parts and the dark parts of the scene. We take the same scene with our camera, and indeed very different picture here. And with our camera, the camera has, with a standard exposure, with like a typical exposure, cannot capture all the details. Captures all the highlight details, especially here as the sky is so dominant in the photograph. So if we were just working away with kind of standard exposure, setting standard metering modes, most likely this is the kind of result we're going to get. Something we'd be very familiar with lots of backlit subjects. You typically get a silhouette type of effect. And as you can see, all of the details here have been captured in the sky perfectly fine, but we've lost all the details here in the foreground. You can just about make them out, but they're all very, very dark. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, you can adjust this exposure afterwards if needs be and bring up the shadow details and bring up the dark details, but you're going to expose noise. When you're bringing up an exposure, when you brighten up an exposure, you reveal more noise in shadow details. So an exposure like this simply is not ideal in this situation. So how do we get it looking like it looks like to our eyes? And that is where HDR comes in. Now, before we have a look at that, it is also important to understand as well that there are limitations not just with our camera's sensors, but there is also limitations with the types of files that we capture our photographs in as well. So if we photograph using JPEG, JPEGs have less dynamic range than a RAW file. So if we have a look at an example here, when we photograph something very, very bright, we may actually lose some details in the very brightest parts of the photograph. And if you've ever photographed a RAW file and compared it to a JPEG file without any corrections, you may find that RAW files tend to look a little bit flatter. They look like they lack a little bit of contrast. And that's because JPEG's dynamic range, the way it captures, is actually smaller compared to a RAW file. Now, this is also a little bit complicated, but I'll throw this one out there to you as well. The histogram that you see in a camera is actually based on a JPEG file. So we've spoken a lot about histograms, but when we're actually reviewing a histogram in camera, it's based on a JPEG file. Even if you are capturing in RAW, it's still showing you a histogram for a JPEG image. So for a photograph like this, our histogram may look like that, as we would expect. Everything's stacked up over on the right-hand side. But in reality, if we're to have a look at this photograph as a RAW file, that information is actually a little bit away from the edge. This is really what the histogram would look like for this particular photograph. Raw files are unprocessed. This means that it only captures the exposure settings and your focal length. It does not add any other settings to it at all. It also has a wider dynamic range because it utilizes the maximum capabilities of your camera's sensor. This is also where you get a much larger file size compared to a JPEG because it's simply capturing more information. And as I mentioned, you may end up with a file that looks a little bit more flat, doesn't have as much contrast compared to, say, your JPEGs, but in the long term, it's much better file for you to work from. You can reveal more detail, or you can bring back more detail if needed as well. So, you know, to maximize your dynamic range, to really get the most out of your camera sensor, you want to be photographing in RAW. And my suggestion really, and this is the way that I would work, is photograph in RAW and JPEG. Memory really shouldn't be an issue for you now in this day and age. There's just so much memory available. You should have external hard drives. You should have large memory cards as well, you know, so that you're giving yourself the room to photograph in both RAW and JPEG. Now, I suspect many of you already have a very good understanding of RAW and maybe photographing exclusively in RAW, but don't worry if you're not at that stage yet. We are going to be having a look at it in depth in the next module and really exploring what more you can do using RAW files. So now that we understand dynamic range really to its fullest, over the last few lessons we've looked at it and we've had a look at some other issues surrounding it there with our camera sensors and our file types. Now we're at a stage where we can overcome it either using filters or we can start using HDR. So why do we want to use HDR photography? And as I mentioned before, sometimes there's a bad association with HDR, that photographers shy away from it because they get this idea that everything looks exaggerated and false. But it really depends on how you use it. We're going to be looking at it in terms of how to overcome exposure, but you can also use it creatively as well. Let's have a look at it in action. So here we have a scene with good dynamic range. Here we have photographed it and it's at 0 on our light meter. It doesn't matter what metering mode we've used in this particular case. We can see that there is good detail right across it, but we don't really have much detail here in the whites at all. In fact, there's no detail there in the whites at all in this particular photograph. We have very, very little black detail. If we have a look at this photograph, based on what the histogram is telling us, this shadow detail is very flat. Very, very flat. And I don't have any white detail at all. This is all grey. So details in both the shadows and highlights, but overall there's a lack of contrast. That's the biggest issue with this scene, is that when we have a mid exposure with the exposure at 0, we end up with a photograph that is just lacking contrast. So let's take a photograph at +1. So we take a photograph, we bump up the exposure by a stop, so we double the amount of light coming in. Now what the issue is that we're having is that the highlights are beginning to appear blown out. Now, if we actually look at the histogram, we can see that there is still some details there, and in fact, really at the very edge of it, we are still losing white detail. There still isn't any white detail there at all. But if we actually look at the photograph, we can visually assess it, and we can see that the details are getting a little bit too bright. We're losing that detail in the mountains. However, we can see that there's more shadow detail has now been revealed. So now that we have more detail here over within the shadow area, this detail has come out a little bit more. It adds a little bit more texture to those trees, but we're also still losing darkness, or we're losing the blacks in that part of the photograph. Let's go the other way. So we go minus the stop and let's see what type of exposure we get. And now we can see that there is actually a lot of contrast. So going by the histogram, we now have a U-shaped histogram. However, there is no highlight detail, or there's very little highlight detail, and there is absolutely no white detail at all. But we've got nice deep dark shadows. So highlights are now full of detail, but we're beginning to lose some shadow detail. And again, we just visually assess this, and we can see that it's getting a little bit muddy, a little bit too dark there. So going through those different exposures, we can see that there's parts of each photograph that work, but there's other parts that don't. So the first photograph, we had good mid-tone detail, but we were lacking contrast. The second photograph, with our overexposure, we were losing highlight detail. And then this third exposure, we're losing shadow detail. So by using HDR, we can combine those three exposures together. And this is exactly what we've done here in this particular photograph. Now we've got a histogram that's a little bit more evenly spread out. Not a massive difference from our original histogram, but just a little bit more detail. We're still losing those white details, but if we have a look at the photograph, really, visually it looks correct to us. So now we've got details in both the highlights, both the shadows, we've got a greater tonal range, and we've also got more contrast as well. So if we think back to the dynamic range on our camera's sensor, so first of all, our dynamic range to our eyes, remember that's 18 stops of light. 18 stops of light. With our digital camera, if we combine the three exposures together, we are compensating for those lost stops. So by combining these -1, the 0 and the +1 exposure, we are creating a photograph that has a dynamic range that matches what our eyes see, giving us a photograph that's a more accurate representation of the scene. Now, so that is using three different stops. So -1, 0, the +1. You can imagine then if you were to expand that even more, if you were to go to add in a -2 and a +2 exposure then as well, that you're expanding your dynamic range even more. And it's when you combine this wider dynamic range that things begin to look almost hyper-realistic, that you're bringing in so much detail into the photograph that it's almost going beyond what the eye can see. And sometimes that can begin to look a little bit busy as well. But that'll all come down with the combination of post-processing that you use as well. So we can have a very natural approach to our post-processing when it comes to HDR photography, or we can go with a much more exaggerated approach, where all of which we'll be looking at in later modules. But let's concentrate then on actually getting out there and photographing for HDR with that specifically in mind. What's the best approach to take? And the first thing I would recommend is it's a good idea to stick with aperture priority mode when photographing HDR. Now you can use fully manual as well, of course. But maintaining an aperture is going to be very, very important, because you don't want to be cycling through different apertures and ending up with photographs that have different exposures, but also different depths of field. So aperture priority is a good mode to be photographing for HDR. For exactly that reason I just said. You want to maintain your depth of field. Changing depth of field between exposures can cause changes in focusing. You choose your preferred aperture, but remember back to our other lessons when we're photographing for landscapes and so on, to choose the sweet spot on your lens. So I'd always be aiming for around f8, f11, depending on the lens that I'd be photographing with. Your camera will control the rest of the exposure then by using shutter speed. And just on that point, make sure that your ISO is not set on automatic, because it could change the ISO. I think it's one of the settings that I'm not a big fan of on cameras. It is a very useful setting, depending, on what kind of situation you're photographing. For example, if you're photographing a wedding, setting the ISO on auto is actually not a bad idea, because the light changes a lot. You may not want to be thinking too much about having to change your ISO on top of all the other settings. But when you're in a situation that's much more controlled, I'd recommend switching off your ISO auto setting and select selecting your preferred ISO. And then remember, of course, that your aperture selections are going to be limited by your lens as well. So, you know, you're not going to be able to open it up to f2.8 if that simply isn't an option available to you on your particular lens. When it comes to focusing, I'd recommend using manual focusing. You know, it's just to make sure that, you know, your camera doesn't decide that it wants to change where it's focusing between your different exposures. So it's a good idea to focus first of all. You can use the autofocus to focus your initial focus and then switch to manual focus. Some cameras, you know, they have very advanced autofocus system, so it may not be an issue for you, but you know, to err on the side of caution, switch to manual focus once you've set your initial exposure. And it's recommended as well to photograph in a matrix and evaluative, or matrix R evaluative metering too, because you want to expose for the entire scene. Remember, with HDR photography, the idea here is that we're trying to reveal as much exposure information, as much detail as possible. So to really achieve that, we want to be measuring the light for the entire scene. And remember, with our matrix and evaluative metering, it does exactly that. It takes into account every single part of the frame, giving us an average exposure reading. So recommended that you use your matrix or evaluative metering when photographing for HDR. And one thing that will be absolutely essential is, of course, going to be a tripod. For successful HDR, really you're going to need something that's going to keep your camera very, very still and very steady. One of a big issues that you will find if you're trying to handhold a HDR photograph is that when you're combining the exposures together, sometimes the alignment doesn't quite match up and you end up with this little bit of ghosting. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. You want to reduce the amount of movement in the scene as possible. Now, you're not going to be able to control any kind of movement in terms of if the wind is blowing and there's leaves moving around the scene from exposure to exposure. That's just something that we can't control. We can manage that. We'll speak about that a little bit later on as well. But really, when it comes to the alignment, you want to make sure that everything is exactly the same from exposure to exposure, and really that's only going to be achieved with a good tripod. Spoken about them before. There's lots of different materials available. Your plastic ones are the cheapest ones. They're going to be the lightest ones. They're also going to be the ones that are most prone to falling over. Not going to be able to carry a lot of weight. They're certainly not going to last you for very long either. Aluminium or aluminum, you know, whatever way you prefer to pronounce that. They're really good, strong, sturdy tripods, but they are very heavy. I've had my one for well over a decade now at this stage. It was a really good investment, only cost me about €100, but it's a bit of a monster. It's very, very heavy to carry around every single day. So, you know, one of the reasons it's lasted so long is that I haven't used it so much because of the weight. So do make that kind of decision as well when you're looking at tripods, is you have to consider how much you're going to be using it, and you can actually be put off using it if it's too heavy, if it's too cumbersome. And finally then we've our carbon fiber type, which are light, very durable, but are also very expensive. So they kind of give you the best of both worlds in the sense that they're light and durable, but you are going to be certainly paying a higher cost or higher price for them. You know, the Manfrotto brand, like the B-free one there and displayed in the photograph, they're very, very good. They've also got the option of changeable heads, so you can actually put on different types of heads, meaning that you actually only need to invest in one pair of legs and you can change the heads. Very, very versatile tripod. It is worth spending the money if you can afford them, because really they'll be the only tripod you ever need. They're great for video as well. You know, they've got lots of different heads for doing video. They can get very, very low to the ground. The middle part actually would extend out and will go horizontal, allowing you to get really, really low. So they're a really good brand to have a look at, but unfortunately you are going to be paying a higher price for them. So as I mentioned, definitely consider the weight, as you are going to be carrying it around a lot. And like I said, don't be like me where you actually put off by it. You know, you're kind of looking at it, you're like, oh, should I take it out with me? I don't really want to carry it out, and so on. So really do consider the weight. And the best way to do that is really to try before you buy. I've said it many times before, but really go to your local camera shop, check them out there, you know, before you kind of buy blindly online, not really sure what you're getting. So with all of that prep done, then when it comes to actually capturing our HDR photographs, we have a couple of options available to us, depending now all very much on the type of camera that you happen to be using as well. Many cameras now have in-camera HDR, or if you go to your camera's menu, and I've just pulled it from a Nikon and from a Canon here, that there is these HDR modes already built into the camera that basically do all of the work for you. So you can select this mode and you'll be able to select the number of shots and the number of stops that you want, and it'll work away and it'll actually create the HDR photograph for you within the camera. Now what it will do, it'll give you a JPEG file. So it'll produce them for you in camera, but you will come out with a JPEG photograph. Okay, so if you want to do it manually, you'll need to be shooting in RAW, and you'll need to take a slightly different approach, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But this is a great way if you want to dive into it straight away. And I definitely think it's worth trying out just to see how your own camera processes the information. As you can see here with the Nikon, you can actually kind of change the strength of it then as well, in terms of what type of effect that you get with it. But do have a look in your own cameras to see if it's an option that's available for you. And very likely you've also seen it in your phones as well. It's kind of a very standard feature within our camera phones now. So if your own camera doesn't have this own feature, you might find that your phone has it, and it's definitely something that you should give a try with and do a little bit of practice with as well. So as I said, you can set the number of exposures that you want to use. You can also set the amount of bracketing in terms of how much of a difference between the stops that you want between each exposure. Sorry about the low resolution image there. But basically what we can see here in the first image is that you can very straightforward select the amount of photographs that you want to combine, and as you'll see, they're all odd numbers, so we don't typically use even numbers when it comes to combining exposures. Now I know there's just the 2 shots there. That's very straightforward, you're just combining 2 exposures together. But generally, when it comes to HDR photography, we'll use odd numbers because you always want to have a middle grey exposure. So you're always going to be using a middle grey exposure. We'll look at that now in a second. And then you're photographing either side of that. So you always have, I suppose, an anchor exposure that's in the middle, and then the other exposures go either side of that middle exposure. If you have other options like auto align and ghosting reduction, I really do recommend using them as well. Auto align will help to make sure that all your photographs are aligned properly. There's no movement in between each of the exposures, and ghosting reduction will help to remove any kind of movement in the photograph itself. So if someone's walking through a photograph, walking through the different exposures, it will help to reduce that too. Now, if we want to take a more hands-on approach, we can have a look at auto exposure bracketing. This is one that I get asked about a lot very early on, typically in the course. But basically, auto exposure bracketing, as you can see there, they allow you to take multiple exposures without having to change the exposure settings manually each time. So it might appear as a button like this on the back of a Nikon, or you may have to dig into the camera's menu to use it as well. Also, just be very careful, sometimes it also doubles as the camera's exposure compensation button. So quite often the exposure compensation button when you're photographing in semi-manual modes actually doubles as your auto exposure bracketing button as well. So be sure to check your camera's manual for this. But basically, you know, how it works is that you're going to have a screen something similar to this. This is just taken from a Canon. And you can see here, we can choose where the exposure starts. So this is letting us know whether we want to increase or decrease the exposure, where it's going to be beginning from on the light meter. So in this case, it starts at 0. you're choosing the middle exposure, and then you can change, whether or not you want to increase that or decrease that by rotating the dial in the back. Below it then we have the actual AEB itself, so you can set the stop difference. You can also set the amount of exposures that you want to use here as well. So if you wanted to increase it to 5, you could do so here too. You can change the amount of difference between the stops if you want to reduce it to 2/3, or if you want to increase it and so on. That can be set here at the back as well. So when you've chosen where you want your exposure to begin at, and I would usually recommend that you go with a straightforward exposure. You start at 0, but it obviously will completely come down to your needs. And when you've chosen the stop difference, then you can start taking your photographs. And how it works then, if we're to have a look at it in action. So let's say we have a scene here. Our settings are, we're at f11 on aperture priority. We've set our ISO to 100. We're using auto exposure bracketing. I've set 5 exposures at 1 stop or 1 exposure value apart from each other. When I take my first photograph, it starts at 0. Remember, we're at f11. So it starts at a 0 exposure, a standard exposure at 250th of a second. When I press it again, it goes to -1, and it goes down to a 500th of a second. So remember, we're reducing the amount of light coming in. And then when I press the button again, it goes to +1. And so we're increasing the amount of light coming in. So it alternates between -1, +1, and then -2, and then +2. And that's how we end up with the 5 exposures. That alternation really helps you to keep track of the exposures. So you know when you move on to a new exposure starting at 0, that it's actually starting at 0. So in this case, because we're photographing in aperture priority, you can also see then as well, the setting that it changes is the exposure speed. I recommend as well, before moving on to a brand new exposure, it's a good idea just to photograph a blank. So just kind of a throwaway photograph, just so when you're actually reviewing your shots, you know where one batch of photographs ends and another one begins. So, even if that's just a case of just photographing with the lens cap on or something like that, even, just once you have some kind of separation between one batch of exposures and another batch of exposures. The whole point there is that you don't have to be going in and changing the settings yourself. Once you have auto exposure bracketing set up, it's going to cycle through those different exposures for you. And then afterwards, it's a case of just bringing them into whatever software you're using, processing the files, and then combining them together, which is what we're going to have a look at when we get deep into our post-processing in module number 4. Now, just a couple of other things then before we kind of finish out the lesson. I just want to kind of clarify a couple of terms. So we've obviously been speaking about HDR a lot in this lesson. Now, what HDR is, it's high dynamic range. This is combining different exposures to increase the dynamic range of a photograph. Okay, so that's the actual definition of what high dynamic range is. It's that idea, that concept that we make more than one exposure of a scene and we combine those scenes, those exposures together to create a photograph that has a higher dynamic range. It is not the processing that happens to the photograph afterwards. So you may have heard this term associated with HDR before, and this is called tone mapping. And tone mapping is really where we get that HDR look. I suppose where we get that idea that this is what a HDR photograph is supposed to look like. But really, tone mapping is when we do the work on the photograph. Basically, it's just post-processing on a HDR combined shot to reveal the detail. Really, tone mapping tries to reveal as much kind of contrast and texture and color in a HDR photograph, because you have all of this extra information that you want to use. So This is a very important term to clarify from HDR. HDR is the process of combining the photographs together. Tone mapping is the work that we do afterwards on the photograph, the finished result, to reveal as much of that detail as possible. And it's often where we get this HDR look from. It's also possible to tone map a single image. So if you want to give it that HDR look, it is possible to do that as well by tone mapping it. This is an option that you will find in Photoshop and other software programs. Finally, then, I mentioned ghosting. And ghosting is when there's movement in a HDR photograph. So when we're photographing, and it's very prevalent in this particular shot, but there's going to be certain things that we cannot control when we're photographing HDR, especially people moving through the scene. So you can see here, this is a really good example of it. And it's not just in these people here walking through the scene. As you can see there, it is also there on the bridge. And that's likely a result from hand holding, trying to create this HDR shot. So as well as the ghosting, there is alignment issues here too. So alignment is when the edges don't quite match up with the exposure that either comes after or before it. And again, you can kind of see it in the fence here. So that's a lack of alignment, but this is some severe ghosting that we have here as well. It is absolutely possible to remove this too using software, and generally ghost removal is very, very effective at removing these kind of issues in the scene. So with all of this in mind, when should you be using high dynamic range? When should you consider using it? Well, as we've seen, you definitely want to be using it if you're having any exposure issues, especially when you're photographing landscapes. So great place to start with your HDR photography. It's good because you're very likely not going to have too many people moving through a scene. You know, you can find a scenic isolated spot, and you can, spend a bit of time practicing, and you should get some really good results as well. I mean, if there's an area where HDR photography is really made for, it's definitely landscape photography. So again, consider your approach with this in terms of the post-processing. If you want to go with super detail, if you want to reveal a lot of texture, or if you want to take a more natural approach, I recommend that you experiment with both. HDR is also great for nighttime photography too, as you can reveal lots and lots of darker information while maintaining some of the detail in the sky as well. And as you can see here, this is kind of more taken at dusk, just after all the lights have come on as well. So very, very good one to practice. It is possible to do nighttime photography using HDR too. You can get some really spectacular results like this shot here. Architecture is also great for HDR photography, again, for similar reasons to our landscape photography, that you can photograph something where there's not going to be too much movement. Hopefully you'll get a situation like this where there's no people either as well. So if you are photographing kind of famous locations, try to go at a time where there may not be too many people about. Either very early in the morning is probably going to be the best time to go, or on a quiet day when there may not be as many people around and so on. So just kind of plan out when you're going to photograph, because it is very, very difficult if there is a lot of people present, to remove them or to reduce the amount of ghosting in a scene afterwards. But as you can see here, HDR here has really, really worked well, bringing back some of that detail in the sky, but just absolutely making the gold here in particular just pop and glow and draw your eye to it without becoming overbearing or losing all the details, like the texture here in the brickwork and so on as well. And similar then to architecture, interiors as well. Now, as you can see here in this shot, we've got a few people kind of in the background there, but not too distracting at all. Certainly not taking your eye away from the tremendous architecture here too. As you can see, the trains running by here, just adding another element. Really, really effective photograph, but definitely consider it for interiors as well, to reveal that shadow detail, give a nice balance to to the photograph overall. HDR loves sunsets, so sunsets are tricky enough to photograph at the best of times, so using HDR is very effective in bringing back some of that detail that you may lose in the highlights. A spectacular shot here, and again a very lucky shot, you know, here in a very busy part of Venice, but relatively quiet. You can see a couple of people, a couple of stragglers in the photograph, all right, but lots and lots of detail here. Fantastic colours really coming off the ground there as well. That nice kind of slick wet ground, just really capturing those colours. And speaking of colour, HDR is great for colour photography too. So in very bright sunny days when your colours are really popping, just give them that extra little bit. HDR is great for getting back some of that colour details as well. Like in this photograph here, such a great contrast between those red and those greens. Nice bit of blue there in the sky as well. And of course, it's also very effective with black and white photography too. HDR is great for black and white photography, not just in the kind of sense that you're bringing back the exposure, but it tends to add a bit of texture to the shot. And that can look great in black and white. As we saw back in our black and white photography, texture is something that we should be looking at when we're photographing in black and white. As you can see here with this photograph, it's erring on the side of being a little bit busy. Obviously a lot of texture there in the waves, with that texture there in the sky and the texture in the pier as well. A lot going on in the photograph visually, but I don't think it's too much. It's a nice effect. You may have your own opinions, of course it's subjective as well, but it's definitely worth trying a bit of black and white photography with HDR too. It's great for bringing back dramatic skies. And finally then, HDR is very often used with abandoned places and abandoned spaces. The look that it produces tends to go very, very well with these areas that have just been kind of dilapidated, left to rot and so on. You'll see it very often used in abandoned type of spaces, abandoned photography. There was a lot of great work done in Chernobyl as well over the years by photographers, a lot of them utilizing HDR to really kind of, I suppose, just to show the details in these kind of ghostly, haunting places. So very often if you do a search for HDR photography, you're going to see a lot of kind of dilapidated, abandoned spaces appear, and it's just that the look lends itself very, very well to this type of photography too. Of course, if you're photographing anything like this, be sure to take care and be sure that you actually have permission to photograph in these places and areas, and be safe as well. So that is the end of this lesson. So thank you very much for joining me for it. We're going to be looking at something a little bit different now for the next 4 lessons. Now that we've kind of mastered our exposure, we've had a look at our histograms, we've had a look at how to overcome our exposure issues, we need to start introducing artificial light into our photography. So we're going to get into studio and flash photography. We'll start things off by having a look at flash photography, having a look at the different types of flash that are available to us. We'll have a look at how flash works. It can be an area that a lot of photographers shy away from, but they are actually becoming more advanced, making them a lot easier to use, a lot more accessible to use. And introducing flash into your photography just opens up an entirely new area of photography for you. We'll also have a look at how to get the correct exposure using flash as well, so that you're not coming out with over or underexposed flash shots. And what we're really going to have a look at is balancing artificial light with ambient light to make it look like that no flash has really been used at all. So for your challenge for this lesson, I'd like you to take a HDR photograph with 5 combined exposures. So if possible, if you have the ability to be able to combine your exposures together, that would be brilliant to see, that you take 5 photographs and combine them into one single image. If you don't worry, a photograph taken on your phone, if you have HDR on your phone, will also suffice as well. Okay, now just a quick note on these challenges too. Remember, they are just for fun. And if you haven't got the opportunity to do one right now, you can always take these and photograph them at a later stage when you feel that your abilities have improved, and then post them up onto the Facebook page. So that is the end of this lesson. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all back here again very, very soon for our flash photography lesson. So until then, take care of yourselves. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome back to module number 3 with myself, William Eames. Did you know that HDR, High Dynamic Range Photography, is not a digital invention? It has literally been used for centuries. The Great Wave is a combination of two negatives to achieve tonal balance, and this is by Gustave Le Gray, and it's circa 1857. Only about 20 years after the official invention of photography. Gustave Le Gray was a technical prodigy as well as an artistic genius as well, and like a lot of photographers that we have looked at throughout this course, has a really fascinating story. You should definitely check him out. But as you can see in this two photograph, we have a combination of two negatives. We have the sky and we have the waves. Gustave Le Gray understood the limitations of his camera, of his negatives, their ability to capture the light in both the brightest and darkest parts of the pictures, hence the combination of two exposures together. You're here with myself, William Eames, your course educator. I hope I find you all in great form, and I'm so glad that you keep attending these lessons. It really is the key to success, is to show up to as many lessons as possible. So, as you may have guessed from our opening facts, this lesson is all about HDR, about high dynamic range photography. Now, really what we're going to have a look at in this lesson is the best practices for HDR, for capturing HDR photographs. We won't be looking at combining those exposures together. That's something that we're going to do in our next module when we start having a look at how to do all our post-production. But really this is just going to have a look at how we can prepare for HDR correctly and why we should use it as well. So HDR, you know, has this association with making everything look kind of hyper real and almost exaggerated in some cases, but it really does have a technical use, and that's really the context that we're going to have a look at it in this lesson. We're going to have a look at dynamic range first of all, and I know at this stage I've spoken about this quite extensively. But really, you know, it's so important to understand when it comes to exposure. And we've looked at it quite a lot now. We've looked at how we can overcome it using our filters and that are available to us. But there is going to be times where we may not have filters available to us, or simply they're just not right for the situation. And this is when we might introduce high dynamic range. But there's a couple of really interesting facts about dynamic range. So first of all, we should be well aware at this stage that dynamic range is the difference between the darkest and the lightest tones in a photograph, generally pure black and pure white. Okay, so we can see here there's a big difference. We've seen this photograph before. Our camera sensors are limited by dynamic range. Now, this varies from camera to camera, but basically, this can affect exposure when there are extreme contrasts in tones. Our cameras cannot see the same way that our eyes see. Our eyes can see far much more detail compared to our camera sensors, no matter how good an exposure we get. And when we talk about the human eye, if we were to measure it, dynamic range is measured in stops of light when it comes to photography. Now, dynamic range is also something that's present in sound as well, for any of you who have any interest in sound or are sound engineers. But when we speak about dynamic range when it comes to photography, we talk about it in terms of light, and as we know, light is measured in stops. So we also know that stops are either doubling or halving the amount of light. Our eyes will see about 18 stops of light. So 18 stops, that's a huge range. This means we can see a huge range of light and dark details at any one time. So that's a huge amount of detail. Now, times when we will see the limitations with the dynamic range of our own eyes is when you think about extremes. So, for example, if you're in a pitch black room to the point where your eyes cannot adjust and cannot see anything, this is when the light is so dark that it's gone beyond the dynamic range that our eyes are able to see. Or if you think about when you're in a dark room and you open a window or you open a door to let light in, your eyes are flooded with light and you get that really bright light that really hurts your eyes. That really bright flash of white light before your eyes adjust, that's again the dynamic range of the brightest light being outside of what we can see. Now, comparatively then, our digital camera sensors, now as I said, this will vary slightly from camera to camera, but the dynamic range of a camera sensor in comparison is 12 stops. So 12 stops of light. The camera cannot see as much detail in the bright and dark parts of the scene at any one time. So think about this compared to the 18 stops of light that our eyes can see. So we have 3 stops on either side that our cameras cannot see. There's parts of the dark detail and there's parts of the bright detail that our eyes can see on a day-to-day basis that our cameras simply cannot see in a single exposure. So let's see how that might look then if we were to compare what our eyes see compared to what the camera sees. So we have a scene here, and this is what we see with our own naked eyes. We can clearly see all the bright details and all the dark areas in the scene. Even with a bright light source, even with the sun going down here, we can still see all of the details. Now, this is just a representation, an approximation of what our eyes would see, but we would expect to be able to differentiate between the bright parts and the dark parts of the scene. We take the same scene with our camera, and indeed very different picture here. And with our camera, the camera has, with a standard exposure, with like a typical exposure, cannot capture all the details. Captures all the highlight details, especially here as the sky is so dominant in the photograph. So if we were just working away with kind of standard exposure, setting standard metering modes, most likely this is the kind of result we're going to get. Something we'd be very familiar with lots of backlit subjects. You typically get a silhouette type of effect. And as you can see, all of the details here have been captured in the sky perfectly fine, but we've lost all the details here in the foreground. You can just about make them out, but they're all very, very dark. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, you can adjust this exposure afterwards if needs be and bring up the shadow details and bring up the dark details, but you're going to expose noise. When you're bringing up an exposure, when you brighten up an exposure, you reveal more noise in shadow details. So an exposure like this simply is not ideal in this situation. So how do we get it looking like it looks like to our eyes? and that is where HDR comes in. Now, before we have a look at that, it is also important to understand as well that there are limitations not just with our camera's sensors, but there is also limitations with the types of files that we capture our photographs in as well. So if we photograph using JPEG, JPEGs have less dynamic range than a RAW file. So if we have a look at an example here,